Welcome to ArtFlakes, the show where we explore the literary work of writers across the globe. So far, we've been able to cover about 5 African countries, particularly in East Africa. We started with Somaliland, then we moved to Kenya, we consider Ugandan literature, and later we moved back to Ethiopian literature. And finally, today, we're going to be considering Djiboutian literature. Djiboutian literature, I'm sure you're going to enjoy that because it's very, very unique in terms of the history, in terms of the location, in terms of their literary work, generally. Very unique. And on the show today, I have my two regular guests, Umar Osabo and Abubakar Isiaka. Thank you for always coming to the show. And let me join them on the other part of the studio so that we can thoroughly go deeply into Djibouti literature. Don't go away. This is ArtFlakes. Yeah, welcome once again to ArtFlakes. As we've said earlier, we'll be focusing on Djibouti literature. As I've said, we're going to be having comprehensive discussion about something that is a little bit different this time around. It's different because Djibouti has something unique. As other countries in the Horn of Africa, it connects the other part of the region or sub-region into, connect them together and brought what we can refer to as a kind of historical background that anyone that wants to really touch the Horn of Africa must automatically look into this country vividly. So on my right side here is Umar Osabo, our regular guest. Thank you for coming to the show again.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah. Abubakar Isiaka, who has been here since the inception of ArtFlakes. Thank you for coming to the show.
Good morning, everybody.
Yeah. Umar, could you please tell us a little bit about the history of Djibouti itself? What do you know about Djibouti?
Well, thank you. Djibouti is a very important country in the Horn of Africa. The country is bordered by Somalia, Eritrea, and Red Sea. Others are Ethiopia and Gulf of Eden. The country has a long history of colonization that ran into over a century. And finally, it was able to get it independent on the 27th of June, 1977. After that, or before this time, the English people have huge interest in the country, and as well as the Somalian, that's the southern part of Somalia, whom they call these people the Alfa and the Isas. The country which was created in the half of the 19th century following French huge interest in the Horn of Africa.
Before you go further, one thing I found out from what you've just said, you said June 27, 1977. Most African countries got their independence in 1960. Am I right?
Yes.
Even the West, even Somalia, Somaliland, West African countries, another part. What do you think could have resulted to this, Abubakar?
I think most of the French colonies got their independence much later. The French were less reluctant to give over their colonies. They are less reluctant to give independence to their colonies. They stayed longer than the British stayed. So, and I think Djibouti is not an exception in this case. They experience the same level of colonization. Which, the funny thing about the French is that they were trying to make African men to become Frenchmen automatically, which was quite impossible. Yes, possible assimilation association, which they brought over, which didn't occur in the British colonial system. So with that now, it's even after they've left for a long time, most African countries who were under French colonial are still tied to the apron string of their colonial master. You check out countries like Cameroon and other countries that were colonized by the French. The French still maintains that relationship with their once colonial territory.
Yeah, Umar, I also discovered something, the fact that the geographical location of Djibouti is so strategic that it's like a border between Africa and the Arab world. What can you say about this part?
Yes, actually, Djibouti is a better country.
Yeah.
The moment you cross the Red Sea, you're already in the Arab world.
Okay.
So that has given the Djiboutians as well as the Somalian, they have this close, a long-time relationship. In fact, as a matter of fact, the Somalian and the Afars are the first set of Africans to have accepted Islam over 1,000 years ago.
Oh, really?
And the people have a rich historical connection with the Arab, where they have a lot of oral poetry and songs, so which is not far from what has to do with their culture or what they gain from their neighbors, the Arab. So it's a really, Djibouti is a very wonderful country, but very little is known about Djibouti, probably because of the language barrier. Mostly they speak Somali language and French, so very little is known about the country from other parts of Africa, but the country has a lot for African people to learn or tap from it.
For the fact that they even got something from the Arab world, and he has also said something on the French world. So this is why I talk about the uniqueness of that part. What about the relationship with when it comes to their writings? What can you say generally about their writings in terms of Djibouti writing, talking about maybe things related to particularly Horn of Africa?
I think if you look at their style of writing, I think poetry has always been a hub of the Arabian world, and like he did say, there has been an interflow of culture from one cultural region to the other. So, and in the Djibouti's case, I think they do more of poetry in terms of what they write, and and most somehow, because based on their religious affiliation, it's not unlikely that their poetry would not be tied to the Islamic religion. So, and they have this form of epic poem which is called the Gabe. It's usually a Somalic epic of over 100 lines. And they also have another kind of poem called Ginili, which is sometimes used for divination, something akin to the, like what we know, we have a type like that in Nigeria, with the one we call Ifa divinational poetry. So we have similar things like that. So, but this but this one has more potency. Ginili has more potency than, it's not an ordinary poem because it has a spiritual attachment to it.
All right. I want us to dwell in this colonial influence. If these people could spend over 100 years in their colony, I think they happen to be the last set of countries that got their independence from. Why do you think, what can you say about their influence, the influence of these French people on the colony?
Well, wherever the French come, the idea of colonization they don't leave anything. They don't leave anything behind for the colonies. They want to take over virtually every aspect of life, down to how they dress, how they appear, and how they speak. So, and in that sense, they were able to penetrate into their cultural realm or their writing realm, and you know, they initiated a style writing that developed over time, but it didn't start immediately. It took time before it came up. So we had them contributing to the language, contributed to development of literature, and it began in the early 1970, not as early as one would have expected though, but
7 years before they got their independence.
Yes, and you know, that means they've stayed for close to 90-something years, and they are just starting, you know, they didn't do much in terms of encouraging locals to write their own literature. And you know, it is always French arrogance. They have that arrogance with them, believing that Africans cannot be as civilized as they are. So there is nothing an African can write that would make sense. So it happens in other colonies like that, but with time the world was to shock them with the inception of people like with the coming up of people like Senghor and Leon Damax, Leopard Senghor and others like that who came up. Even from, I think, from Cameroon, where you have Kamara Lai. So, you know, yes, it shocked them to see that Africans can actually come out from their own destiny and create something creative, as much as writing a novel or poetry. So, but this one developed late. It started in the 1970s, and you had them contributing, the local newspapers, then the French newspaper, then, which was the only newspaper available then. I think it's called Le Réveil, encourage writing. And from there, a young writer came up whose name is Hussein Abdi. So in 1970, and he published his first book in 1972 titled Abdi, Child of the French Territory of Afars and Issas.
Okay, Umar, one thing I also find out, look at the languages we have been discussing now. We have got 2 foreign languages influence on their literature. We have got 2 local languages, Afar and Somali. How do you think these people have been able to utilize this language? Which one got more influence than the other? Is it the foreign or the local, and why?
I think... well, before I go into that, but let me just say it on the head. I think the local language has more influence on the people because back in the Middle Ages, we have this very important work which it appears like an epic, just as what we have in the other part of African country. The name of the book is Futu al-Abasha, which was written by Futu al-Abasha, written by Shihab al-Din in the Middle Ages. Is a work of poetry that chronicles the conquered of the Abyssinia or the Ethiopian, so to say, and it's a kind of an epic, similar to what we have in the ancient Mali of Sundiata, similar to what we have about the Shaka of that is the Shaka Zulu, the Zulu tribe, and also the El Hajj Umar, the conqueror of Syrian, and other places. Even in Nigeria, we have things like Ozidi Zaga by John Pepe Clark, which is a popular Ijo epic, and so many others. So really you could see any part of African society or country which does not have one form of poetry or epic in particular, celebrating the lofty deeds of their legend or hero, so to say. So coming back to how language influences the people of Ethiopia and the literature of Ethiopia, I think Djibouti, the closeness of the people and their ability to tap from their neighbors is one of those factors that actually influence the people. But what influences the people mostly is their native works, because back in the Middle Ages, apart from the Futu al-Abasha, there are other literary works which is mostly in oral form. And by the time you look at this, if I can vividly remember what Osidio Okpeho said, that most African society or most African history is orally documented, which passes from one generation to another. Yeah. I think the same thing is applicable to the people of Ethiopia. That is why from record, we were made to understand that they have a very long history of oral poetry and narratives. So from that angle, you can see their native language has more influence on the people than the foreign language, which is French.
You know, as an addendum to what he has said, I think, you know, like he did mention, the native language is mostly documented on the oral form. I think what the Arabic and French language brought in was the opportunity for documentation.
The written
yes, it brought about a written form of poetry, which was quite different from what they were used to, whereby you have to put everything into your head or know everything offhand. But now there's an opportunity for writing. There's a language, there's an orthography for documenting this thing there, and they latched onto it and applied it.
So how would you look at Leopard Seda Senghor?
Okay, fine.
I think they have he had something related to Djibouti. He had an influence when you talk about the issue of translation, editorial work in France, you know, but because at this time they were doing some publications.
Yes,
they had to go to France and get some of those things.
I think one of the first young writers that emerged from the Djibouti had his book edited and also vetted by Leopard Seda Senghor. So that's where his area of influence is most pervasive. He was able to encourage the young writers, and you know, these people look at him as a source of inspiration because he was writing in a language which they could also flow with. So being there on the scene and assisting them to help get their work published was a great effort on his part. And he did not only do that in Djibouti, he did that in most French countries, assisting writers to come up. And even at the time, he was the one who organized the conference for the Negritude movement in Africa, where Olawuyi came and said that a tiger cannot pounce and show his tigritude.
I think if I may come in, there is something slightly missing. I think the writer my friend is referring to is William Siat. William Siat is actually referred or regarded or considered as the father of Ethiopian literature. Djibouti. I don't know my problem with Ethiopia.
You just love them.
I just love Ethiopia. So William Siat is actually seen as father of Djibouti literature. He actually have a collection which was published far back in 1959.
We will be considering that in detail. I would want us to look at this. You mentioned something that I feel we need to dwell more into. Last time when we were talking about Kenyan literature, if you can recall vividly, we look at the influence of Chino Achebe on the life of the father of Kenyan literature. And now today we are talking about Leopard Seda Senghor from the same West Africa, having influence on William Siat, you know. So what can you say about the connection?
You see, the nexus is something that every literary scholar will not find it difficult to understand. Because literature, as it mirrors society, what happens in Caribbean, for instance, you may see some traces of it in the Middle East. And some of the things that happen in the Middle East, you could see it traces in South Africa, East Africa, as well as what happened in West Africa. You could also see it traces in the East Africa. So the influence of L.A. Senghor on people like William Siat should not be anything to be seen different from the context of literature, because there is what we call intertextual relationship. Just as we have international relationship. If you go to Nigeria, for instance, you will see ambassadors or representative of most countries there. So also if you go to Kenya as well as other parts of the world. So the same thing replay itself in literary works. So there's this connection between what happened in whatever part of the world with another part of the world. So Achebe influencing the writing of Ngigu Watiengu is something which is very, very normal in literary cycle. So also Senghor influencing people like William Siet, among other writers of the Ethiopian, Djiboutian, is very normal. Is part of the trade. Is part of the relationship. Just like if you look at the English literature, there's a period we call where poets are celebrated, just as we have in Djibouti, the period of Elizabethan, the Elizabethan period. But there's this particular set of writing that I want to talk about, which is called the courtly love poetry. You know, at a point, people like Edmund Spencer, William, Philip Sidney, Thomas Wyatt. Like Thomas Wyatt was at a point in time a representative of United Kingdom in the France, in the French-speaking community. So he got this idea of writing for mistresses. And when after his tenure in France, he came back to England and he started writing that kind of poetry. And before you know it, people like Philip Sidney, people like Thomas Wyatt, people like George Herbert, and even the later John Donne and John Milton, which they also wrote on this. For instance, the John Milton Paradise Lost. The idea, the connection is not far from is not far from what Thomas Wyatt, which they normally call the elder, brought to the British literature. So it's the same thing all over the world. Yes, in as much as literature is concerned.
I think more than that, I think that history was quite kind to Chinua Achebe and Senghor, because they were part of the few people who struggled who got education. No, I wouldn't say struggle, because quite at that time there was everything provided for them. And you know, Leopold Sedar Senghor went studied in France and all that. And you know, it was his poetry came up even far earlier than Chinua Achebe, before Chinua Achebe started writing. So these people were looked at as a father. It came at a point whereby it came like a shock to the world when the world had believed that nothing good ever comes out of Africa. Then they see this man writing in a way that was quite fascinating, that on an equal level with the French writers of those times. And Leopold Sedar Senghor, one thing about him was that it was not just that he was a writer, he was also a thinker, a great thinker of his time. And that's why he was able to propound the negritude ideology. So for someone like that being at the forefront, those at the back who are developing will look at him as a mentor, as somebody who can inspire others. So his charisma definitely pulled other writers to him, and because of that, now he was always ready to act the role of a father and be as an inspiration on them. And hold on, please. And that, you know, that of Chinua Achebe. Chinua Achebe also, history was quite kind to Chinua Achebe. His book came out at a point whereby we were looking for what can you actually call what can you define as the archetype of a true African novel. And like that, Things Fall Apart came out, and it was a celebrated book because it depicted the African condition and how colonialism came and seared everything apart. So with that now, Chinua Achebe was given a fellowship to travel about, and he came to Kenya and met this young man, Ngugi. So there he picked the book and said, oh, this book looks good. Then he sent it for publication. So he acted like, because he saw himself as in a position to inspire others, and that was why he was given fellowship to travel about Africa, so that others can see that this thing that you people think is impossible, this man has made it a reality. And so being from the English world, in Kenya being an English country, speaking country, it's most likely that Ngugi would told the part of this thing.
I think if I may come in from there, you see, in literature there's this common term we use, muse.
Muse in poetry.
Muse in poetry, as well as even in playwriting or novel, you get amused, you get inspired. Sometimes trees, sometimes vegetation, sometimes your environment, sometimes the current happenings influences your thinking, and you reduce this into writing. Just like my friend have said, actually Achebe, Elesengo, and others influenced some young writers, just like people like me have been influenced by Ben Okri, because and Onyi Ogumba. Often I find it difficult to talk literature without mentioning these two names because they so much inspired my kind of writing and my style of writing. But what I really want to talk about here is they were writers. For instance, Emo Tutolas, who wrote the Palm Wine Drink Art, earlier before Achebe's Things Fall Apart came on board. And also Kameralei, who also wrote the African Child earlier before Achebe was coming on board. I think it's just a blessing. Because in whatever you do, there's a blessing of God in it. Sometimes people will say it's not how far, but how well. Okay, the fact that Umar is here discussing African literature, that does not mean that Umar is the best student during his MA or BA or whatever, but it's just a God blessing and grace.
Yeah, that's why I think you mentioned the fact that they are blessed, the two of them, by history. History
favored them a lot.
The part I want you to, sorry, before you clear that side, you can clear it together. I just want to run this part up. I want you to look at why you are doing that, concluding this part. That Anglophone, Francophone discrepancy in African literature. I want you to just discuss about that, where you just round up what you want to say. Yeah. All right. Okay. Fine. Because I'm looking at the strength and the how the people from the West, the Anglophone units and the Francophone units, having influence on the eastern parts, because that's what I've seen now. I've not seen having the eastern literatures having influence or commanding the literary world of the West, of the West Africa. So what do you think could have resulted to this?
The way I see it from, like you said, apart from the issue of faith, quite right, we had Amos Tutola, the Palm Wine Drinker, and that was in 1952.
Yeah.
I think that was 1951. Yeah. Then we had, followed by Kameralei, who wrote The African Child, but it was written in French. Yeah. Amos Tutola's problem was that the critics felt that it was depicting a part of Africa, a part of Africa that the young Africans developing then didn't want anything to do with. They felt it was the painting a diabolical picture of Africa, a tale of witches and wizards and magic, and they didn't want that. They couldn't see his ingenuity for what it was then. It was much later that Amos Tutola became appreciated. So then he was condemned as what was this man writing? And then but after Amos Tutola wrote, Cyprian came and wrote even the people of the city. But the people of the city was considered a pop literature, that it wasn't, it was more like just what James Adi Chase was writing. So, and people didn't appreciate it as much. That was in 1954. Okay, fine then. And after that, the Kameralai's book, they said it was just nostalgic. Somebody venerating his African culture. But when Chinua Achebe dropped Things Fall Apart, it came like, it was more like the critics accepted it as a true depiction of what Africa is, or what it experienced under.
Because it has a colonial context.
Yes. No, even that was one part of the thing they told Kameralei. They said his book was not depicting the presence of the colonial masters in this thing. It was only about nostalgia, and that wasn't anything for them. So, and the influence of, if you are looking at what influence the West Africa has on the West African part people have on the East African literature, I think it was much because before their own literature began to develop in foreign language, we are okay, sorry. The West African people have already mastered some of this form.
Very good.
So it helped them to become like a mentor to these people.
Okay.
But their own influence came much more in terms of the Arabic language, because the Arabic language flowed through that part, then down to this part from Mali to so. And in Northern Africa, in Northern Nigeria today, you still have so many novels and writings.
We're going to discuss about these in detail when we go. We do exploration, because we are almost out of time now. By next week, we'll be discussing about the textual aspects of the Djibouti literature. And please tune in next time. This is ArtFlakes of CBA. Thank you so much for your contribution as far as but we are still going to invite you next time where you're going to discuss about the textual part of the Djibouti literature. Thank you so much. Au revoir. Yeah.